So what do you think?
It's a beautiful day. We're in a cornfield and we're going to talk today about best management practices to ensile corn silage.
Great. So when it comes to that, you can see that we're getting ears that are beginning to turn. This is the sign I always advise growers to wait for the husks to start turning dry. They're not there yet. We see most of them green. I did pick a couple of ears where we have some dry husks that are dry, and we still have corn that's in the late dough stage in the early dent. So a dent stage is when the kernels change colors from yellow to orange. And this particular variety is a faster, softer starch, faster dry hybrid. So it doesn't show its hard starch until about 40% milk line. So what we're seeing already is, what do you think of those hard starch development? How much would you say you've got on that kernel there, Mireille?
I probably would say we have like a 15-20% milk line on these kernels. And what I would suggest, especially with the variety of hybrids that we have, is usually your best bet is to track your dry matter. Even you don't have to do it all the time, but by starting maybe at dent and figuring out that you're losing around 0.5% dry matter a day, at least you'd have a clearer idea on when you should be harvesting the corn. And it is extremely important, again, to measure that dry matter, and you don't have to send it to a lab. All you have to do is actually chop 3 or 4 and measure a representative sample, and it could be done in a microwave or in a coaster oven. But this is, if I have to suggest something, knowing your dry matter, knowing your moisture is one of the most important things we could do to manage corn silage.
And so when you say manage that moisture, what moisture range do you want to have for highest quality performance in the cow and in the yield for the grower as well?
So if we're looking at piles or bunkers, which are typical here in Idaho, what we really would like to see between 65 to 68% moisture. Now, in the case of bags, if you're on a medium size, a smaller dairy, you're using bags, you could probably go drier 2 or 3%.
So what do you think, what do you see on starch accumulation per day?
So we typically see a range of 1 to 2%, averaging around 1.5%. And this is important because if you remember from a daily nutrition point of view, starch is your source of energy. So starch is what is going to be helping you provide energy to the high-producing dairy cows to produce the milk that we collect from her or harvest from her.
So what would your estimation be? What could a dairyman think in terms of would be a reasonable starch percentage for harvesting today? If we harvested a little on the early side and we were harvesting today, what could we anticipate for starch?
That's interesting. You never should ask about a lab value looking at the corn, but if I have to guesstimate, we're probably talking about a 17% starch here. And usually what you want is you want to have values that are not less than 28 to 30%. The more starch you have, again, the more energy that corn silage is going to give your cows. You could go overboard with starch, and when your corn mature, some of the starch might become resistant to digestibility in the cow, and we don't want to get there.
So if I heard that right, 1.5 starch per day on average, and we're in that less than 20% range. We want to get into the 30% range.
Correct.
That's 10 points, that's 5 days. So about a week
Correct.
would be really a nice time to cut this corn. Would you think that's...
Absolutely, yes. I think, and I really, again, go back, measure your moisture, measure your dry matter. That will give you a clearer idea on when to cut. But just looking at this, which is great, because we do need ways in the field to know or to guesstimate when we need to harvest. Looking at this looks as if it'll be ready in a week or so. So we've cut the corn, and there are a few tips that we need to consider when we go to the pit to maximize the quality and the performance of the corn silage in the pit. And the most important thing to remember is the reason why we're doing corn silage. The reason why we're ensiling corn is we are using a fermentation process to preserve the forage by lowering our pH. So what we want to do is monitor our corn silage and move from an aerobic phase in corn silage fermentation to an anaerobic phase that will help us achieve that low pH, less than 4 for corn silage, that will preserve the quality of the forage. And for that to happen, Rick, I think the most important factor is how well we pack that pit.
Right.
So because what we want to do is kick that oxygen out. How do we do that? Is we pack that corn silage. By packing it well, we want to achieve a density of 14 pounds of dry matter per 1 cubic foot.
Okay.
That's our objective. That's the minimum. Then we know that we're getting that oxygen out of that pit as soon as possible. Because you see huge variations from hours to 2 days of aerobic fermentation. And every time you get that phase, every time you have aerobic activity, you're losing dry matter. So you really want to minimize that. So packing density is extremely important. And we've been talking, I know you know that we've been talking about this for decades, but we did a survey at the University of Idaho several years ago, and we still found that a third of the dairies we've surveyed did not have adequate density in the pit. So this is extremely important, and it will pay. We always say be detail oriented with your corn silage, because that's going to last you for a year.
And that's a great point. We were detail oriented in our plant population, in our emergence. If you'll see, we have very uniform earring across this whole field. Agronomically, we have grown a fantastic crop. It's uniform. It's not quite ready yet. So we pay a little more attention as we finish this crop off, and we can continue to multiply our efforts by getting more tons, not only out of the field by harvesting it 10 days later, but also having maybe 5 to 10% dry matter loss rather than 15 to 20.
That's correct, and that's some of the shrink we're seeing. We're seeing some 15 to 20% shrink in corn silage, which is like throwing 15 to 20% of your harvest in the garbage. So we really have the tools to do that, and we really need to follow best management practices to do that. One more tip before we move on is, you know what helps your packing is knowing the weight that you have, like your tractor weights to pack that corn silage. So if you know the weight of your tractors, all you have to do is divide by 800, and that will give you the tonnage of corn silage that needs to be delivered per hour to the pit to achieve that minimum 14 pound per cubic foot.
Thanks for that great tip and all these great tips.
Thank you.